be problems for the Nazis. In Vichy France, there was a strategy of no banks. You are trying to recruit underground officers. You are trying to sort of get an underground together. You're trying to sort of be more useful than actually harrying anybody. Over time, once Hitler invades all of France in November 1942, it's bangs all around. And you're trying to be strategic about it. You want to get the submarine pens. You want to get certain railroad crossings. You want to get certain telephones and telecoms taken out. Frequently, it was just little raids, but often enough, they had grand strategic aims.
So what were some of the biggest commando raids that you see in this time period?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm really not an expert on like all 400 agents of SOE. So I want to bracket it by saying I'm probably not the right strategist to talk to on that front. I know that, for instance, Lise de Baissac's brother, who was in Bordeaux, was attacking submarine pens and the port in Bordeaux, and also managed to get out a bunch of intelligence that basically stopped gun running to Japan from the Nazis. So if you can be near a port, you will attack the ports. Some of the things they did were kind of hilarious. For instance, SOE managed to get cartons of itching powder into uniforms that were being sent to submarines. So an entire submarine would be like plagued by itchy uniforms. There was a wide variety. There were some of those kind of James Bond toys that were used, like the itching powder. Once D-Day is on the horizon, everything bends in the direction of D-Day. From that moment on, they know what their goal is. Their goal is to be useful when the invasion comes. And they want to spare their material for the big invasion.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Let's look at that because it seems like everything is leading up to this moment. So what resources were set in place? And once they get the notification from BBC France that invasion is imminent, it will happen tomorrow, what happens? What are all these different resistance cells doing?
So they didn't want to organize the resistance cells by geography. They didn't want to say that the North should do this and the South should do this. They thought that was giving too much information to the Nazis. So it was a blanket order. Tonight's the night. Everybody go out. Everybody. So they took out the major roads and they took out railroads, which meant the tanks that ordinarily could have just had an easy trip from elsewhere getting deployed to Normandy took almost 3 extra weeks. Normandy itself was almost completely isolated. You couldn't make any lateral movement across Normandy because there were trees across the roads, strategic roads, and bridges were taken out. And that, again, was all coordinated centrally, but they didn't want to give individual orders. They didn't want to tip off their hats too much to the Nazis. Though at that point, everybody really knew that they'd be coming in the summer of 1994. They just didn't know where or when.
Huh. Right. And do you have a sense of how many people were involved if we tally up all those within the resistance cells that were set up by the SOE? And I imagine be substantial with delaying the Nazis to 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think it's about 300,000 troops. I can't remember the number of divisions, but around 300,000 is the number that's sort of sticking. I can look it up. I don't have my book right in front of me, but it was substantial.
Yeah, that's huge because in the SOE, it's a few hundred people total. And
right,
then 400.
Yeah.
So from this, one person could be indirectly in command of over 1,000 people.
Oh, absolutely. You would expect any unit and any sort of central with an organizer who has a radio and say, a career or 1 or 2 lieutenants, they might have 20,000 to 30,000 men that they are organizing for.
Yeah. So do you have a sense of what it looked like on the night before D-Day that perhaps a cell of 1,000 or 2,000 people, the order comes through, then the SOE soldier says to her lieutenants, all right, get to work. And then this village starts to cut down trees or cut down bridges or...
Absolutely. Everybody's listening in France to their radios. By June 1944, everyone is stuck to the radio every single night. They know something's happening. And Lise de Baissac, who ends up, she was really the biggest sort of lightning bolt to me as I was researching. Lise was second in command of a unit in Normandy, right behind enemy lines, like right behind the beaches on D-Day. She had been in Paris when she hears the alert, and she gets on a bicycle, and she bicycles 3 days through German formation, sleeping in a ditch when she needs to sleep. She bicycles 3 days to get back to her unit in Normandy. And she will do a lot of receptions of material. So whereas early in the war, so what you're doing is you're waiting in a field one night, say, and a plane will come by and it'll drop containers of guns. And an ordinary drop might be 5 containers of guns, grenades, weapons, explosives. By the time D-Day comes, they're going to start dropping 60 containers a night to her operations. So she will be on the ground in some field receiving 60 containers with enough men to roll those into a farm somewhere to distribute them to the resistance and be back again a night or two later and receive another 60 containers. She's also coordinating and we have to remember that D-Day is one day, right? But that the battle for France takes all summer, 1944. And for the first 6 weeks, the Allies are just sort of trapped on the beaches. They don't move anywhere. They take the Cotentin Peninsula, and that's it, right? You've got Cherbourg, and you can't go anywhere. They don't break out until Operation Cobra at the end of July. Once they get the breakout, end of July, the front starts to move very, very fast through France. They were stuck, in the bocage, in those thick thickets. And then suddenly they can start going like, bulldozers through France. It moved so fast. The front was sort of progressing so fast at that point. No one knew where it was. The generals couldn't find it. It moved so fast. London couldn't tell. And so part of what Lise would be doing at that moment is she would send runners to the front to find out where it was. And they would either report back to her or run over and cross into Allied lines and let them know. So it was kind of like a modern day Thucydides at Marathon. She's the one giving this very critical kinetic intelligence back to the Allies.
Yeah, what's really interesting is you saying this reminds me, I had a guest who was in Ramadi in 2003, and he said the breakthrough of them being able to gather intelligence was they would have women in their unit who would speak to Iraqi women, mothers typically, because their kids would run around and play all over the place and then come back. And they were this sort of honing beam or this human radar that would see everything that was going on and tell them everything. And they would be the hub of all the information that could then relay it back. And he said that was what gave us intelligence on the ground in the town of who was an insurgent, who wasn't, and just made everything crystal clear. So yeah, it reminds me that it sounds like that.
And this is critical. This is a really key point. I mean, I try to make of my book. We have mistheorized war as this utterly masculine activity. And it makes our guys less safe now to say it should only be men in combat units and on the front line. If it weren't for the females in those units in Iraq, right, they would not have that communication with the mothers. Having women in traditional cultures is critical for the safety of our combat units. And that is part of why we've been fighting these forever wars for 20 years. It's part of why we finally gave the military full sexual integration, because it made our guys safer today. And these are lessons that we sort of learned and forgot in World War II, because overwhelmingly it was men writing the histories of World War II. The story of what women were doing and the story of the way women's work in the war and the story of how feminized France was has been lost by the men writing the story. And it's not just historians. I mean, it's a leadership failure too. General de Gaulle, at the end of the war, is trying to craft a narrative of a Fourth Republic. And he doesn't want France to be a humiliated nation, and he definitely doesn't want France to be a nation that collaborated. So he uses the French resistance as kind of the spine of the Fourth Republic. France was a nation of resistors. Everybody was in the French resistance. It's not true. But he used it towards that end, and he built a new nation. And he thought that women they didn't fit that story. He needed to project a strong France, and women are frail and fragile. And so he left women out of the story intentionally. And to that end, he also wouldn't allow himself to be photographed on the Champs-Élysées with Black African soldiers who were a key part of the liberation of France, because Blacks too projected a kind of desperation that he didn't want as part of his new national narrative. So there's lots of reasons we forgot this lesson in 75 years, but the lesson remained true in France in World War II as it does in traditional cultures in our forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Something I'm curious about too, you've mentioned the memory of the SOE. There were documents when you were researching it. Some of them were recently declassified, so you could get a bigger picture of this. How well known is the story of the SOE? Were elements of it overshadowed by others trying to craft a narrative, and these publicly available facts were thus sidelined? Or were the activities of the SOE, parts of it classified, so therefore we don't know as much about it until now because of this?
So it's a combination. In Britain, SOE is pretty well known because it was the whole sort of craftiness of British troops gave the Brits something to take pride in when they'd been very thoroughly humiliated over almost a 6-year war. And so the whole James Bond thing is kind of the way Britain finds self-esteem at the end of the war. So SOE was a key part of that. That said, we don't know. They made massive mistakes. I mentioned the radio games. They, couldn't find some of the women after the war because they didn't know. They wanted to keep everything so classified that they didn't want to reveal that they'd sent women behind enemy lines. So you're liberating concentration camp after concentration camp. And the way you would ordinarily find a soldier is you put their name on a Red Cross list or you give their name to the Vatican. It's kind of like Go Fish. If the Germans have that name, they have to give them up. But if the name isn't on a list, you don't have to do anything. The Allies didn't want to put female names on those Red Cross lists. They didn't want to reveal that they had sent women behind enemy lines, that they had lost women behind enemy lines. And they also didn't want to reveal these tactics to the Soviets, who were about to be the very next enemies. So a lot of those mistakes don't get revealed until we declassify the files. But there was a lot of outrage in Britain, so there were different inquiries about what happened to SOE and what happened to the people who were captured and whose fault was it that they were captured. And that was pretty well known. Because women are so rare in war, there were only 39 of these women, they become symbols quite easily. Odette comes back. She has saved her commanding officer's life with this fabulous romantic lie. Then she marries him. So she becomes kind of this, spokeswoman for SOE and becomes a symbol that unifies France and Britain when France and Britain were not on the same side for 4 years, right? So a lot of storytelling and a lot of symbolism gets in the way of knowing the true story of SOE. And as I said, we all know about it. We all know about 007. We all know about Miss Moneypenny. We haven't really learned the stories behind the stories. And part of that, too, is because what they were doing was classified. A good agent isn't supposed to leave much of a trace. It's hard to recreate what they were doing because that was sort of the point.
Yeah, it's tricky to find these people. It's got to be annoying for tracking people in the archives whose job is to be hidden. Well, thank you for sharing all this. And is there anything else that you want to touch on that you feel there's a legacy here that would enrich our understanding of World War II or D-Day or other parts of the war by knowing this story?
I think the point I just keep wanting to hammer home is that war isn't uniquely macho and masculine. War is almost entirely feminine in an occupied country like France. And like you were talking about the examples in Iraq, we need to pay attention to that. We need to pay a lot more attention to that, not just because women deserve participation trophies, but because it makes our guys safer today, because it is important for our national defense right now to remember that. And I also just want to say something about centering women and participation trophies. Like, it bothers me when the World War II geeks object to this kind of storytelling. One way I like to frame this is if we were to point to any single moment in World War II that overwhelmingly changed the course of the war, there could be some broad consensus that decrypting Ultra would be at least in the top 3, right? that was work overwhelmingly done by women.